First of all, let me apologize for not speaking Spanish, but Italians and Spanish are like brothers divided by a language. We can understand each other by emotion, but sometimes we have some problems. So I will try in English. Of course, many thanks to the e-commerce organization for this invitation, which I appreciate very much as a recognition of the Italian contribution to the issue that we are discussing today, starting from the Escuela di Milano, who started this topic of the restoration of modern since the very beginning of the 80s. And here again, I want to thank Carlos Sambricio for having started his introduction quoting Raymond Queneau, because I want to start my speech quoting another writer, well, not only a writer, but a writer and a scholar of text, which is Pierre-Marc de Biasy, the president of the Institute of Modern Texts and Manuscripts, the ITEM, who in a recent essay called Les archives de la création à l'âge des numériques, observed that as most writers have begun working directly on the computer, no trace is left of the genesis and development of their work. Literature is becoming a realm from which the rough copy has been banished. Nowadays, as we all know, writers write using text software, making correction directly upon what they've typed, and then, just send off the final result to their publishers in the form of a file attached to an email. With the advent of the digital-born manuscripts, we found ourselves in a situation in which nothing is left of the patient work of erasure, substitution, and continual rewriting that goes into the final result. In medieval times, we had the age of parchment, whose best expression is the palimpsest, which is not a material object, but it's an approach to culture. And then we have known and experienced it myself, in my generation, the age of paper, which preserved all the work of correction to a text, generating not only text, but even more what you said about Ginsburg, the hermeneutic of the text. And now we have reached an era in which the most widely used support for writing absorbs all pentimenti. Hence, the paradoxical proposal by Pierre-Marc de Biasy to develop a software that could create a new file every time the text is changed, thus preserving each and every correction in chronological order. Which goes actually in conflict with another paradox, the paradox of the hard disk. That means that what was invented to enhance memory actually poses the greatest threat to the preservation of itself in its material aspects. Richard Turdiman, in Present Past, Modernity and Memory Crisis, has observed that the advent of the modern world in the 19th century turned memory into a cultural and social problem. That means that from just being a natural source of comfort and reassurance, memory became a cause of anxiety for those bought too little and too much of it. And just to quote the title of the most recent book by Paul Cornerton, Modernity Forgets, unlike a culture based on written texts, our culture, based upon mechanical reproduction, does not tend to leave traces. Furthermore, digital communication reduces the profundity of thought to a sort of very a veneer, a surface of images, forming a continual cascade. The images which such communication produces are not, let's say, engraved upon our minds, subverting the value of remembering. Their serial concatenation intensifies the process whereby they are consigned to oblivion. And all this takes place alongside the development of a veritable industry of memory, in which, sentimentalized as nostalgia, memory becomes consumer merchandise and the object of political negotiation. I don't know a better case study on this respect on the city of Berlin. Since unification and the fall of the wall in 1989, the city has borne witness to a disturbing oscillation between two opposite impulses, memory and forgetting. The traces of its, let's say, unpleasant, very recent history, means the former history of East Berlin, have been erased, enclosing the wall in itself, while at the same time an attempt has been made to bring back to life the more remote past of the city when it was the capital of Prussia. And the best example of this is the one-to-one mock-up of the Bauer Academy by Karl Friedrich Schinkel, which is actually, you know, together with the reconstruction of the Schloss, of the Imperial Schloss, cause of debate in Berlin. The whole process seems predicated upon the belief that one can turn back historical time and stop it at a chosen point in a sort of very reinvented past. On the other hand, it is significant for me that talk of the restoration of the modern began in the 1980s, which coincides with the foundation, roughly, of Docomomo in 1987, because in the 80s, this particular notion became part of the culture of conservation at around the same time that postmodernism was gaining currency, and the idea of the post-histoire was first being advanced, ultimately to be formalized by Fukuyama's 1989 announcement of the end of history. What does it mean, the end of history, in few words? It means that history as a completed process is finished, and the present marks the final and definitive point of arrival. And so, Fukuyama replaced the idea of history as an object of research with one which saw it simply as an archive of facts, a sort of gigantic database. In effect, the modern cults of monuments celebrated in 1903 by Alois Riegel became, some 80 years later, our present-day cults of the modern. Are we to hail this as a victory or recognize it as a defeat? Within this context, the issue of the conservation of the memory of the 20th century becomes crucial, attended as it is by a number of paradoxes. Some of them have been just highlighted by Carlos Sambricio introductions. On the one hand, this focuses upon the need to preserve architectural heritage of the 20th century, but are we sure that this is a full recognition of its historical value in the sense encapsulated in the Alois Riegel description and observation that I'm quoting, by the mere fact of being a monument that is having existed for a certain length of time, every work created by the hand of man enjoys the right to be protected? However, This conservation might also be read as implying that such architecture has lost its use value. Its operational life is over, and now it becomes a museum of itself, a museum object. Here, of course, one cannot fail to perceive the irony of this shift in role, from living participant into the present to witness of the past, for a modern architecture which was first inspired by the need for a rebellion against the paralysis of the past. In other terms, we could say that born to be new, the modern itself finds itself old, reduced to being the ruin of itself and at the end of its career in the world. So, its old age is still perceived in a very different way to that of antiquity, and thus requires distinction to be made even at the level of terminology, because we are speaking about conservation of modern heritage and not conservation to go. The ancients themselves saw that memory is linked with topography. For example, the art of memory was based upon the ability to associate images and concepts with a network of locations, each point, let's say in a virtual room, corresponding to a specific thing, a specific idea, a specific concept to be remembered. But in a fluid society, which has substituted the notion of flux for that of place, how is one to remember when everything flows past and there are no fixed points of reference? However, while this fluidity apparently undermines memory, never before in history has humankind had the technical ability to expand archive capacity on a previously undreamt scale. Thanks to the use of digital equipment, we can record ever greater quantities of data. We can accumulate veritable thesauri of both material and non-material values. Indeed, there is such an excess of information that what is at issue now is not the ability to accumulate, but rather to select, to evaluate, to separate the useless from that which can add to our knowledge. Caught between hypermnesia and total oblivion, we are, however, without shared criteria necessary to make socially significant choices. And as a result, each cultural decision is afflicted with a relativism that fuels controversy rather than creating identity. Now, how does all this affect the issue we are here to discuss, let's say conservation of the modern heritage? To summarize the argument I want to put forward here, I would in schematic terms say that its result is a lack of clarity in the strategy with which to approach the collective value of memory, reflected in a certain indecision with regard mainly to two key aspects of remembering. What is to be remembered and how? So it's the quantity and the quality and the approach. One of the basic facts one has to start from is simply that of quantity. As we can see from the UNESCO policy concerning World Heritage Sites, an increasing proportion of our planet is becoming the object of some form of conservation and general protection. Furthermore, the focus of such protection has gradually shifted from conservation of individual buildings to the preservation of entire urban districts, landscapes, sites, and even, as I said before, the non-material aspects of culture studied by anthropology, let's say oral traditions, rituals, historic system of interaction with a particular environment, even languages, even the use of particular idioms and languages. And the same phenomenon can also be seen with regard to the heritage of the modern. The first form of protection concerned themselves with single buildings of powerful, symbolic, or evocative association. For instance, the Bauhaus building in Dessau, the Dessau Teachers' Accommodation, of course, the Weissenhof district in Stuttgart, which I believe was the first case study in restoration in the second half of the 80s, and Terragni's Casa del Fascio in Como, just to quote, a few exceptions. Then, conversation brief began to expand exponentially, covering works that were even more recent. From Gio Ponti Pirelli's skyscraper in Milano, which is a building that dates back to the beginning, the end of 50s, the beginning of the 60s, to Carlo Scarpa's Olivetti showroom in Venice, which has just very recently been completely restored and transformed in a museum, a foundation and a museum of itself. So do not forget when you go to Venice, first of all, to pay a visit to Carlo Scarpa. And now we have reached the paradox of what one might call proactive conservation, concerning itself with works that are less than 20 years old. For instance, which I find very expressive, Rem Koolhaas' villa in Bordeaux was actually declared a national monument just 3 years after its completion in 1998. So this means, in practical terms, that when the architect Rem Koolhaas was asked to make some alteration, he could not alter his own project. Included within the actual category of monuments and placed on a par with their counterparts from more distant eras, these buildings have been the objects of restoration that, setting aside the issue of questionable results and the wide variety of methodologies used, has sanctioned their consecration alongside the great architectural achievements of the past. However, around these individual masterpieces extends a much vaster field, ranging from the enormous patrimony of disused factory buildings to the much larger quantity of buildings, not always by name architects, which have, since the beginning of the 20th century, become parts of the urban fabric of our expanded cities. The very scale and variety of this heritage is in part still obscure. That's why some time ago, in an exhibition in Porto, Michele Cannata and Fatima Fernandez defined this heritage as el moderno escondido, comprising social housing, detached house, apartment buildings, offices blocks, shops, and so on, forming a portrait of what we could call the everyday modernity, not the heroic aspects of modernity, but the everyday modernity. This heritage poses the real problems for a traditional approach to restoration, which still mainly is intended as restoration of the individual masterpiece. And this problem arises from, let's say, two basic reasons. First, the impossibility of acquiring the financial resources necessary for intervention upon the scale required, which is a problem that we have to face, all governments of all nations in Europe, and not only in Europe. This is one of the first problems we have to face, the scarcity of resources. Second, the absence of shared criteria for recognizing quality, for evaluating the appropriateness of preserving what to many is just an unpleasant reminder of an aggressive modernity and in no way part of a familiar reality. Pessac, les Quartiers Frugier, the Marseille Unité d'Habitation, the Corviale development in Rome. Yes, we have just a couple of slides to show. For instance, this is the Robin Hood Gardens by the Smithson in London, which is at the moment a very hard debate about preservation. This is the Corviale in Rome, the huge building built in the, at the beginning of the 70s by Fiorentino, which is, as you can see from the title of the manifesto of this book, is not okay, but KO. And of course, the Narconfin communal house by Moshe Ginsburg in Moscow, which is at the moment object of very hard negotiation, which, I mean, we can see the way people inhabit this, that we consider as an absolute masterpiece and a monument, but the difference of the use is strikingly different from the images that we had from our memory. And most striking of all, especially for us in Italy, I would point out this case study of this building near Naples, which is called the Le Vele, the Sails, which is a huge complex of what Bruno Zevi in the 70s called the Italian approach, or the Italian way to megastructures. It's a series of apartment units on a very large scale called the Sails of Scampia, which now you are seeing in pictures shot from the movie Gomorrah, that I think it's very well known even in Spain. So, I mean, this is, on the left, we can see an image of a detail of the Sails of Scampia that we study on as a reference point to a part of our history on the textbooks, on the handbooks, and the other side you see the degradation, the decay, and the sort of reception that has received. So these are just few cases that remind us of the continuing difficulties in the reception of the modern that we have always to keep very strict in mind when we face the problem of conservation. Each one of them poses the same problem, the social and cultural, rather than the mere economic cost of conserving traces of the modern, in a situation where intellectual elite and actual communities cannot agree on their value. So, how is one to achieve reconciliation with a past which many still perceive and experience as an overbearing presence? How is, let's say, one to establish a generally accepted criteria upon which to decide the right of such structures to continue to exist, and even the right to be preserved and maintained? How is one to evaluate the impacts of the transformation that this heritage must undergo if it is to survive and perform a role different to that for what it was originally intended? And what about the legitimacy of the intervention required to make such structures comply with new energy and safety norms? Then, again, there is another issue which we should consider, the issue of demolition. Demolition, partial reconstruction, and addition of new buildings to old parts of building remaining. When it is legitimate to preserve the value of entire stretches of urban fabric, for example, in the case of social housing estates or the industrial facilities, brown areas, and at the same time provide a new lease of life through modification. And finally, who had to be the agents in processes which extend beyond the boundaries of a specific intellectual discipline to involve collective decisions in which there is a clear political component? Of course, a key role here must be played by those who work in these fields. First of all, the architects who, with increasing frequency, would be called, not only now, but furthermore in the coming years, to evaluate the opportunity or the need to recycle buildings that have lost their original function. But a not less important role will be played by critics and historians, whose task will be to draw up maps and charts that make it possible to recognize and to chart the increasingly complex territory in which every single building is a potential monument, awaiting the King Midas, whose touch will transform it from anonymous structure to a worthy object of conservation. So the urge for new inventories and for supporting, starting from university where we are now today, supporting research from new generation. This issue is of a no small importance, and once again highlights the changing, never static character of architecture, a character that must, time and again, be redefined within a rapidly changing context, whose very essence is influenced by the shifting cultural perspective of a specific, historically determined society. In effect, if one is to evaluate the past, one must be reminded the perspective from which one is viewing it. The notion that l'école des annales in France applied to historical source is also valid for our architectural heritage. Far from being a fixed entity, some sort of pre-existent seam or a quarry to be mined, some hidden treasure waiting to be discovered, heritage is a cultural and ideal construct. It's the result of an intentional awareness that identifies it as such. In short, our heritage is a project which changes as we change. Sure, the heritage is not a fixed idea, but is something that continuously modifies itself, its consistency, and its quality. So this view of restoration as a veritable project led us behind the notion of a defensive, a merely defensive safeguarding, to a vision of conservation as an opportunity to rethink the instrument and rationale of architecture. The starting point is the architectural work itself, a body which is being examined by the architect who aims to trace a profile, a patient profile, like a physician with a human body, to identify its fundamental characteristic and then deduce potential uses that are sustainable with the particular form of its spaces. In this sense, I would dare to say today that conservation begins by writing or making history. Since the 1990s, it's been a sort of accepted commonplace that design creativity is the preserve of the artists. The idea being that the whole strength of a project or a design lies in its iconic status, in the abstract dimension of image, unsoiled by any contact with mundane words of technology, use function, budget consideration, client requirements. It is this attitude which is reflected in an approach to restoration predicated upon the recovery of the supposed purity of the original work. By reducing the structures to a mere image, this is a very nice case study that I discovered on internet. It's the website of the Robbie House Foundation, the restoration project with, as you can see, is starting from here. This is, I mean, the original aspects, and this is the actual state of conservation. And then they show you how adding pieces by pieces, and color by color, tone by tone, even carpets, floors, and everything, they go back to what they say the original state, which is a pure clone of the previous material. So, reducing, as in this case, the structure to a mere image, this discards the complexity of the building as a physical material reality. On the one hand, therefore, there is the desire to underline the value as art and testimonial of buildings which had initially been conceived as the expression of an ideology predicated upon function, flexibility, the acceptance of the non-permanent, and the experimental limitation of durability. On the other, there is the dilemma posed by conservation, which does not always have defined technical or intellectual responses to the various issues raised by this desire to prolong the life of such modern architecture without distorting its main features of image, space, function, and use. When is one then to apply the term restoration rather than modification, maintenance, or planned conservation, or proactive conservation? When is one justified in partial demolition or reconstruction in order to preserve the overall value of entire stretches of fabric and yet grant them a new lease of life through modification? The very wealth of terminology reflects a degree of uncertainty in both concept and procedure. It is a situation for which Rem Koolhaas, since his last exhibition in the Segima Biennale in Venice, and actually at the moment in an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, has coined the term chrono-chaos. The difficulties in understanding how we are to rebuild and remember led towards the creation of a new sort of artificial memory, based not so much on the linearity of history as upon synchronicity. It is a situation in which the past extends and overlaps with the territory of the present. However, far from representing the vindication of an authentic culture of history, these overlaps seems to manifest itself in a series of contradictory ways that lead one to ask, history, okay, but what history are we talking about? History in what sense? Is it history envisaged as a process that continues and thus acts upon the contemporary, or is it history reduced to the mere status of pure image, let's say a fetish of itself? The problematic interwave of theories, practice, approaches that underlie the general term conservation of modern heritage is a clear symptom of this state of aporia. Even the supposed specificity of the 20th century architecture, in both ideological and material terms, can be a source of doubt and uncertainty. Of course, the techniques adopted in the 20th century broke with a millennial tradition of building technology, well known to us both in its compositional components, its behavior over time, its suitability to environment conditions. In effect, pre-industrial architecture forms a sort of rather homogeneous and widespread corpus, an heritage that can be conserved with a good degree of efficiency. While, on the other hand, we are rather less well versed in the restoration of cement, concrete, glass, ceramic, steel, plastic, for instance, as be proved in Milan with the restoration of the Pirelli building after the attack of 7 years ago. And we know even less about how to reconstruct the essence and design of the finishing and fixtures in such materials. Furthermore, whilst traditional architecture seems to be linked with the notion of a stratification, the era of paper that I mentioned before, we are even more perplexed when it comes to compromising the iconic status of modern architecture as modern. These are structures that we have learned to appreciate from photographs that appeared in books and magazines published at the time of their creation, and thus each one of them seems to be endowed with a dual existence. On the one end, there is an entirely virtual existence, that is the one that we saw in the screen at the moment, a sort of temporality with no specific site and no indication of time, often in black and white, and therefore even more abstract. These have a powerful influence upon the imagination of both students and scholars. On the other end, there is the real life of the structure, which comes after the heroic period of modern architecture, which is, as we can see from these other sets of slides, a life made up of normal use by inhabitants, perhaps even destruction due to war or simply neglect. The presentation of buildings as perfect objects within a geometry that does not allow for disfigurements of their previous status has so conditioned our vision and idea of these buildings that even now they seem to project the message, noli me tangere, do not touch me. Furthermore, one must recognize that a general negation of decay, aging, and even death has become a characteristic of our vision of life, often resulting in a sense of rejection or even repulsion towards anything that has the character of a ruin. Despite the best intention of some of the thinkers and founders behind the homomo, this attitude has often generated an immediate impulse to make things as they were, perhaps even improving them, just overlooking the very reason that we want to keep a building. The focus has been solely upon how we can technically do so. Application to a building of our notion of cultural heritage requires first and foremost an act of historical rather than technical awareness. It implies recognition of the value that the structure bears witnesses to, the value it has acquired for us in social and material conditions that are very different to those in which it was first created. Hence, conservation, whatever you may call it, restoration, redevelopment, or maintenance, reveals itself to be the first step in the construction of a collective identity, in which a trace of the past adapts to the context of the present as an active participant, not simply as the reproduction of some presumed original purity. Almost always, the image made pristine is nothing but an embalmment corpse, the external appearance preserved, but the essence lost. As it has been observed, protection nowadays requires the development of a new conception of the artistic in architecture, a concept less obsessed with being seen, more concerned with the requirement of reuse and redevelopment. And I would like to remember that reuse is almost never spectacular in character, as it is iconic architecture. It is predicated upon trial and error, upon compromise and the establishment and the research of new criteria and new equilibria. It suggests an approach which views intervention as an exploration of the secret body of the building, a search for alternatives, and sometimes even as something that should remain invisible and self-denying. Every intervention upon a structure implies a series of options, posing the awkward choice between painstaking but falsifying reproduction or openness to the idea of transformation. A genuine conservation nowadays cannot limit itself to deep freezing that which exists, nor can it assume that just being of historical interest always and everywhere guarantees the right to a continued existence. Each act of conservation implies various levels of transformation, which guarantee the transmission of the past into the present. Seen in this way, it does not paralyze the exercise of creativity, but rather offers a valuable lesson to architecture itself. That is, do not forget that you embody a process of ongoing negotiation, hence do not take refuge in the false worship of the iconic. The experimental status of conservation arises from its willingness to listen to the work in question, focusing upon the body, the material body of the structure. Conservation strives to explore the truth about how this material is put together, a truth that may perhaps be disguised by facing wall and surfaces. So we must always remember that conservation does not offer only one single solution. It implies a constant risk of taking decisions with regard to the new and the unforeseen. It searches variable equilibria, bringing to bear a whole range of different tools and instruments. Restoration, modification, planned conservation, all respond to different choices, and we can see in this cartoon how these different choices can correspond to a different view of the object itself. With regard to the approach we wish to adopt towards the existing building, indeed, each of these, let's say, answers oblige us to abandon the facile certainty that a work of architecture is an unchanging, lifeless object. Instead, as Franz Graf in Switzerland has so oppositely observed, conservation marks a development in the strategies of design. And this is very important for architects. There is not such a separation in a certain sense between designing the new and designing the restoration, because they are parts of the same approach, a design approach. Its general approach may be predicated on established protocols, but it offers no a priori answers. Each and every case raises specific problems which require specific resolution. There is, however, one single ineluctable truth. Each restoration à l'identique is a dangerous illusion, is a deception that denies the process of memory and replaces the complexity of stratification with a mere mirage, with a ghost, which, like almost all ghosts, is both disturbing and disconcerting. Thank you.